You just heard Overreaction from Voivod from the Killing Technology record. This is the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And we would like to thank our executive producer this week, once again, Jill Hundey, who some of you know is a relative of ours here, is one of our executive producers for the show. So we really appreciate it. And in addition to that, we should mention before we get really into our very special guest here in a moment, that we're having a giveaway as well.
The Thursday and Friday passes for the Maryland Death Fest, these were donated by a listener, not by the organization. I want to put that out there.
Yep.
And basically all we're asking from you is if you can put some kind of link to the show on your blog, tell a friend about it, have some kind of evidence. You can email us back at requiempodcast@gmail.com. We'll use the random number generator. First person, pops up, you get 2 free tickets.
Sure. So yeah, and let us know. Maybe if you only need a Thursday ticket, let us know that, and then maybe we'll random generate 2 numbers, and we can have.
And if you
2
scalp
winners.
them at the door or something, give us $10.
Yeah,
buy us a beer.
Buy us a beer. Yeah. And I know that you putting that out there in advertising the show will be very beneficial to our guest tonight. We'd like to welcome Mr. Jeff Wagner. How's it going, Jeff?
Oh, hi. Thanks for having me.
And Jeff, tell us why you're here. Why in the world? Why in the world did we ask you to be on this podcast? Yeah,
I don't know, because I'm looking at these photos and I'm thinking these are some great tunes. I really want to check this out. No, I wrote a book, Mean Deviation. I guess it probably qualifies as the first book on progressive metal, and there's a lot to talk about there because I don't really consider progressive metal one sound and one style like I think many do, and it was my opportunity to kind of dig into it and show, exactly what I think this vast world is kind of all about. So that's why I'm here to talk about it.
What's your metal background, I guess, for people who maybe don't know where you fit into this? Because you've been around the scene for a long time and been an integral journalist and things, just as Mark and I have kind of floated around in the scene for a little bit as well.
Right. Well, as you guys know, you become a fan first, and I'm a long-time fan. I hate to date myself, but I was buying Voivod records and Bathory records and Metallica records when they were brand new in the store. I'm in the '80s, so it's like, I've been a long-time fan, and I've followed all kinds of different, not only metal but music, rock music and stuff. So, as you know, the more involved you get into it, you end up becoming a contributor to a zine, and then you end up maybe hosting a college radio show like I did for a while in Iowa City. And, one thing leads to another, and you just get more and more involved, where you take it to the level of involvement that you want to. And I just became kind of a paid fan in some ways. I've been making a living on this in some way or another since 1994. So, why not keep doing that? So I've worked for record labels, Relapse, Century Media, The End Records. I was an co-editor at Metal Maniacs magazine for about 5 years. I had my own zine for a time in the early 90s. So I've kind of had my hands in sort of different positions and done some different things. So finally led to writing this book. And I think that's something ultimately that was always a goal of mine, I think.
And what kind of prompted you to, I guess, look in at the progressive metal genre over, say, other genres that are floating out there? Just the fact that maybe no one had looked at it yet, or is it kind of more near and dear to your heart than other, say, extreme?
It's both that. It's both that this kind of book hadn't been written yet, whereas the book on Swedish death metal has already been written, and that's a book I would have liked to maybe have done. The book on death metal has been done. There have been countless books on other bands that I might have liked to write about, but this hadn't been done. And a lot of it is near and dear to my heart. I mean, I think the one constant of my listening in metal has been sort of gravitating toward these innovators and these, weird kind of bands and these bands that push forward and are, radicals in the genre. Because contrary to, I would think, what some other people might think, metal is largely conservative, or at least it is in a lot of ways, and a lot of bands toe that kind of conservative line. And I've always been more interested in the bands that are going to surprise me every album, even if it comes with a disappointment. I always want to be eager to hear that next album to see where this band is going to go.
Sure, absolutely.
So it is near and dear to my heart. It's something that, the bulk of my metal listening has always had all these kind of weird progressive bands within it. So,
and I like how you kind of set that up in the book and your kind of introduction where you were talking about Angel Rat from Voivod a little bit, and how, you know, even if on initial listen it was maybe disappointing is the wrong word, but just utterly challenging for you to figure out, you were sort of up for the challenge, whereas you said a lot of your friends who tended to be more in that conservative realm just couldn't go there and just wanted it to be Nothing Face Part 2, and so that's kind of that energy that you've taken as your sort of your modus operandi for your metal listening career, you know?
Yeah, very, very much. And you said it all right there. There's nothing more I can add to that other than the fact that, these friends who were listening to Voivod and had followed them up to Nothing Face, I thought it was really interesting that they would be so shocked. Well, I was shocked with Angel Rat too, but I was attracted as well. They were repulsed, and it was like, this is a band that's constantly changed. I mean, when Killing Technology came out, it was just so advanced from Roar, and when Dimension Hatros came out, it was so advanced beyond anything Killing Technology had promised, and they kept doing that. And so, to me, Angel Rat was just that next step. It might have been not only the next step, but a kind of extreme left turn, but it's still very Voivod. And I think time has. I'll stop talking about Angel Rat now because you guys, stop me, because this album, I can go forever. I could write a book on Angel Rat, but
gotcha.
Maybe I will one day,
sure.
To all the 5 people out there that would be interested. But really, that album, has, shown to have a bit more life, over time. Like I've talked to so many Voivod fans that are like, you know what? And this is like 15, 20 years after the album came out. Like, you know what? I really get that album now. Like, I understand it. Or maybe they're just more ready in what they accept as a listener to sort of embrace that album that they weren't ready when they were like 20 years old. You know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
That album is kind of caught up to people, or they've caught up to it. So,
yeah, and
fascinating album in that sense.
You'll find that, I think a lot of times that happens, and you go back and revisit things. Mark and I are constantly talking about that in the show, where something missed us the first time, or we just weren't in a mature place to be able to understand where something sort of fits sometimes. And I think that's really the whole idea of progressive metal, in a sense, or of this term, which is such a big term. I
wonder if we should. It's addressed pretty well in the book, but just so people are not, because I think it's kind of a divisive term. If you hear prog metal, sometimes people are just automatically close the door on it. I wonder if what's in the context of your book, Jeff, what would you consider progressive metal? What does that kind of that term mean to you?
Yeah, well, first of all, you can just take out any band that sounds exactly like Dream Theater or very close to it. That's not a diss on Dream Theater.
I'm
not a Dream Theater hater, but you understand. Like, when I went into this book, it was like, my vision of prog metal is so different than the people that follow Dream Theater and the bands that are very similar to that. There's that whole strain, of what's considered prog metal. I think when you say prog metal, people think of these kind of bands, whether you want to name drop Symphony X or Evergrey or whatever it might be. And for me, like, if you sound like any band, you're not being progressive, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really more of a staunchly individualistic sort of stance that you're taking with the genre that you're playing. This one, of course, being metal. That's kind of separates you from the rest of the pack, who are just sort of like following a certain style, So when you say progressive metal, it doesn't mean one thing. So it's hard to answer your question in a short soundbite, and I think that's why it took me like 350 pages to write about it. No, really, because it is Dream Theater, it is Fate's Warning, it is Queensryche, but it's also Mayhem's Grand Declaration of War. They're not a progressive band per se, but certainly that album was, game-changing or a serious left turn, very brave, very innovative, and I think that makes it progressive. Deathspell Omega are progressive. They're twisting metal into some bizarre shapes that have never been heard before, and I think the quality of what they're doing makes them a progressive band. And then you've got tons of stuff in between those poles, and it's it's not a sound, it's not a genre per se. It's really a mindset and sort of an approach and an application of a variety of influences into metal. So it's really it is anything goes.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's great. Like not every band that throws the kitchen sink into their music is going to be great, but it's a lot of things.
Sure. I mean, it's like art, you know. I mean, there's safe art and there's kind of challenging art in terms of like maybe painting or illustrations or things like that. And sometimes just doing something wild and crazy doesn't really bring value, you know, but sometimes it does. You know?
Yeah.
So
but it's a lot more interesting. You know, it's funny because I just went with a friend of mine who is sort of a watercolor painter. He's kind of just getting into that. So he's kind of right now stuck on doing the landscape thing that you've seen a million times.
Yep.
And he's really good at it. But it's like we went to this gallery for some reason last Saturday, and all these paintings were of just, I guess, I don't know if you call it realism or naturalism, but you're looking at paintings of things that you can look out the window of the gallery that we're in and see. And I don't find that interesting. So I guess if I was in a gallery of like all this avant-garde art, it may not be all great or, you know, evoke a response in you, but it is very interesting no matter what. And I think I look at prog metal the same way.
Yeah.
You know, it may not all be great, but it's certainly, I think I'm just fascinated by seeing, you know, who's doing what with the form. That's just a little bit different, a little bit left of center.
Yeah. And I guess for between the two of us here, you know, I guess I've always been more coming out of a higher interest in progressive metal, I think, than Mark, where Mark's coming often from, I guess you were more of a connoisseur of like kind of the stripped down, not to say that you hate, you know, or don't dislike it. But
no, but I think the definition that Jeff threw out for progressive metal is not necessarily what I always thought of progressive metal.
Yeah.
Because if you're saying progressive metal in those terms that you just mentioned, that makes sense to me. Those are the kind of bands I enjoy. But I'm thinking of extreme technicality, almost a musicianship over composition kind of vibe. That's what I typically thought of as progressive metal until this Mean Deviation book actually changed my outlook a little bit, so I think everybody should go out and pick it up.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm glad you say that, not just to sell a book, but because I've had other people say that, and I had a good friend tell me that you know, this kind of, he thought this was a line in the sand, and this really kind of does change the definition of progressive metal, and I'm glad for that, because it can be super technical, it can be super performance oriented, and again, some of these bands I think are great. Some of them, they're definitely wanking, and that's all they're doing, and in the book somewhere, especially chapter 13, the very divisive chapter, is it basically says, look, you know, a lot of these great progressive metal bands are excellent players, but you don't need to be. I mean, look at Celtic Frost within the Pandemonium. That was by far, that remains one of the most progressive metal albums of all time. Always will be. You can call it avant-garde too. I mean, to me, avant-garde and progressive are somewhat interchangeable. Yeah. But they weren't great players, you know, but their imagination was amazing. Their imagination was so much vaster than a lot of these sort of, what Mark was saying, these performance-oriented bands, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess for me, when my entryway into like this type of music was kind of through the guys in like early high school, like through the Pink Floyds and then the King Crimson, and then sort of discovering the Opeths and the Porcupine Trees, because I'm a couple of years younger than Mark and a few years younger than you. And then through Porcupine Tree, Opeth kind of stuff, I went into Camel and Cressida and some of that kind of stuff.
Right on.
You know, and I mean, I had heard Atheist and Cynic early on, and that was very eye-opening. But for me, I think in my early or later high school period, I think Opeth and Arcturus were like the key two bands. And I was telling Mark before this, I think one of the reasons I gravitated towards this stuff a little bit more was because I was one of those kids in high school who was always trying to like validate my love for heavy metal to naysayers.
I'm with you. Yeah.
And this was like the shiny examples I could sort of throw out to people and say, look, you think metal is Pantera? Well, here's this. This is like different than what your definition of metal might be. And I really liked the reaction that I was able to get out of people. And, you know, I've always kind of been that provocateur in a way, whereas Mark is more of the punk rock, fuck you, I don't care kind of attitude.
The traditionalist. Hey, you know, there's room for being the traditionalist, and I like a lot of traditional bands.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I get what you're saying. I had a reader give me one of the most amazing sort of just private reviews. He didn't post it anywhere. I think he might have had a blog, but he posted it and sent it to me, and it was an incredible review, very thoughtful. But one of the things he kind of was saying in it was like, why didn't you really push the idea that this is metal sort of growing up, and this is very mature metal? Like I didn't come out and say black and white, very definitively, like, metal is about more than just, skulls and babes and fire. You know what I mean?
No.
But I don't think I needed to, because I think the whole of the book speaks for itself in that manner. And I have neighbors here in the country. They're in their 70s, and the wife of the couple especially is really open-minded. She's an NPR listener, that kind of stuff, very liberal. And she was interested in metal a couple of years ago and asked me about it. And I was just starting to write the book, so I told her, like, look, just wait for the book. And in the meantime, I recorded her some music, and it blew her mind how vast and interesting and colorful and artistic metal could be. She just had that vision, like Jason is saying, about metal just being kind of this horrible thing that he felt the need to validate. And,
like the heavy metal parking lot.
Yes,
like heavy metal, exactly. And I was able to at least change her mind about it. And she's in her 70s, and that was really it was a really nice feeling.
Sure.
That's fantastic. That's kind of a rare occurrence, how it is.
And I've always argued with people too, because Mark and I, worked at a record store for years with people that, the manager of the store plays in a very, I guess progressive would be the right sort of way, progressive jazz, improvisation, 60s free jazz kind of stuff, a lot of Sun Ra influence and Coltrane, all that kind of stuff. And so we kind of were in that realm, in a lot of these bands, the Opeths and Arcturuses and things, Slaves, Catatonias, and the bands like that were the bands that he would glob onto, and kind of you could tell it would pique his interest because it would challenge what his ideas of metal were prior to us working there. And so that was always, again, like him validating that was like important to us because his opinion mattered so much because he understood rock and roll, the whole history of it.
Hearing that stuff, and then like, well, maybe you guys should check out Can or Faust or pulling out all this kind of stuff. Steam Hammer.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot of appeal, I think, to metalheads for that older prog rock that was really changing the musical modes of the time, and vice versa. I think there's some progressive rock heads, some older guys starting to discover some of the more adventurous metal that's out there, and I think that's a really important thing that's happening, and that's also something I try to underscore throughout the book, is that relationship between progressive rock or experimental rock and metal, and why the attractions exist, and go both ways. I find that kind of interesting as well. How many Camel albums has Michael Okerfeldt helped sell?
Yeah, no doubt.
And lots of metalheads have gotten into Camel because of him. Sure. And, King Crimson's one of the first non-metal bands that metalheads tend to latch onto because of their abrasiveness and their darkness and their
Well, even the way like Lee Dorian would talk about Mellow Candle. I went out and got the whole discography that I could find at that point, purely based on his recommendation.
Yeah.
Sure. And you hear threads of these older bands and these newer bands, and it's pretty exciting. So it opens up a whole new world. So,
and there's that great story that Steve Wilson tells, in the foreword about getting Still Life. That was such when Morning Rise came out, or when we heard it was coming out, and we found out Steve Wilson was going to be part of that. That was like, for me, that was like two completely different worlds about to collide, and suddenly my friends that I had gotten into Porcupine Tree, I could like move them like cattle towards like extreme metal and kind of be like, see, look, somebody else gets it, and that was a big game changer for a lot of people in my realm who were in either the metal camp or the more softer camps, if you will,
Yeah, and Wilson sits sort of in the intersection of prog and metal, and that's the reason I approached him to write the foreword, because it would be too obvious to have somebody like Portnoy or Michael from Opeth do it.
Yeah.
But he kind of like sort of bridges those worlds. So.
He's a validator, too.
And seeing it actually come into his music as well, which you don't necessarily see quite as much in the more metal stuff going into Porcupine Tree records.
Yeah, which is cool.
Totally. Their early stuff was totally devoid of metal, and you can tell at what point he started to listen to Tool or Meshuggah or whatever.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of cool. It's been a cool thing for that band as well. I think sometimes Porcupine Tree hasn't been totally successful in integrating metal, but I think by now that they're he's become a master at that.
And I think they're kind of been adopted by a lot of the metal community, and then vice versa, with some of the metal stuff being adopted by Porcupine Tree fans, and that's always good for everybody.
They're kind of like the anti-anathema. Like they actually, they picked up this whole different crowd.
Yeah.
Anathema is struggling to try to shed the metal and then just go, on with the post-rock or whatever they're doing now, or whatever they want to be called, but they're always stuck in that thing.
Now, for you, before we dive kind of back to the beginning with Voivod and some of the music we're going to play, was there like a band or something that kind of affected you and pushed you towards this type of music? Like for me, it would be like, say, the Opeth or Arcturus, But did you have a band?
You mean prog metal in general? Sort of
just
not really. I remember having, a fascination with Rush and especially Moving Pictures back when I was like 12. And that remains my favorite album, not just for nostalgia's sake, but I just think it's a perfect album. And it's my favorite. It's the Desert Island album. But then I discovered like harsher, heavier metal and got into that and kind of, put Rush to the side for a while. And no, it really wasn't. I mean, I think from the 80s, Voivod and Fates Warning are probably the two biggest for me that are constantly evolving. They're making great leaps every album, and those are the most exciting in the more progressive realm for me. So I guess those two I hold up.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because the band we just heard, Voivod, kind of seems to be in I guess in Mark and I's opinion, one of the two bands alongside Celtic Frost that kind of seems to be the impetus for, I guess, progressive extreme metal. Would you, what made them so special, I guess, Voivod in the Canadian scene?
Well, I agree with what you're saying first about Celtic Frost and Voivod. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to just those two bands for that very reason. So you're very much on the same page as I am there. What makes Voivod special? I think I don't think it's one particular album. I think it's that span of, like, if you look at everything from War and Pain to Outer Limits, that 7-album span. It's incredible. Like, every single album is different. You could tell these guys started just hardly knowing how to play their instruments on their earliest recordings to just obviously pushing themselves very, very, very hard with each record, not only in terms of playing, but in terms of growing that concept of Voivod and how imaginative they were. I mean, it was a complete world. They not only gave you music, but each guy had his own sort of character and his name, kind of like the way Kiss did. And also, Away doing the cover art, he would take the Voivod character into new worlds with every album cover. So, I mean, they were just this complete package. And, they were the first band I heard name drop bands like Pink Floyd, who to me at the time in the 80s were just that band that does money on the radio. And I didn't like it.
Learning to Fly or something. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was like I didn't quite understand the depth and greatness of Pink Floyd at that time, but they were the first one to make me think about it, and they were the first one to throw up, odd names like Faust and Kahn and Van der Graaf Generator, in interviews, and that was always very intriguing. So, obviously very eclectic listeners, and they pushed their metal about as far as it could go, and you have to appreciate them for that.
And they're a band, like, for Mark and I I kind of was a little bit into Voivod back in the day with Dimension Hatros and Nothing Face, but then I kind of put that stuff aside. I think I came into it a little too late, in the early 90s when they had already come to their, like you said, the end of that 7-album cycle, almost in a way. And I didn't really have anyone else around me that was, like, really into Voivod. And I know for Mark, you heard some of their 90s stuff and it didn't really grab you because it was already so odd at that point.
Yeah, because I was so entrenched in that death metal thing and just wanting to explore that genre at that point. Like, vocally it was weird. The kind of dissonant guitars weren't really doing anything for me at the time. I wanted, like, crunch. And now going back and listening to stuff, I'm like, why the hell did I never pick up a record the entire thing? It, like, it spans, like, from almost like hardcore punk to, I mean, they never sounded like anybody.
No.
But those first early records are dirty and tons of energy to them, and, like, I love that stuff.
Yeah, even those, like, I mean, yes, they were, I think it was easier to spot their influences maybe on War and Pain. You could tell they were into, like, Venom maybe, but Piggy had, as we were talking about Chris Reifert's drumming earlier, pre-interview, so
Yeah, pre-interview.
Nobody knows what the hell I'm talking about. But
We were talking about
Chris
last
Redford
week,
being a
we were
rocking
talking about
drummer.
that.
Piggy was a rocking player. So on War and Pain, you had, he was miles ahead and beyond like Mantis from Venom, even though
Absolutely.
they were trying to be Venom at that point. Like, he was just throwing out these riffs that were just like, he was using all 6 strings, and his leads had this rock inflection to them. So right from the beginning they were different, and
Sure.
they just they just got more and more and more different. So,
And the song we picked, Overreaction, or that you picked, was actually one of the songs that Mark and I played when we did our 4-part Canadian metal history podcast a couple months back. So
Right.
it was one of the Voivod songs we picked.
yeah, it's hard to pick a song. I think that's just the quintessential song from that very first point where Voivod started to really jump into the beyond, I think.
Sure.
But you could pick any track off Killing Technology and it would work. I mean, Forgotten in Space was on that playlist early on, but Space Considerations, I chose a slightly shorter song.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's the tough part with Prog. Sometimes you could run into some time limitations for sure. But
Yeah, I told Mark, like, if you tell me 40 minutes, I could easily do 2 songs and we'd be out.
you just play Edge of Sanity Crimson, and be done.
Understanding Crimson, yeah, easy.
In
right.
and out, in and out.
Right.
Mark and I have talked about maybe doing an Edge of Sanity Crimson show and just like kind of pausing it in the middle and talking
That's a
about
great
some
idea.
things, maybe.
Yeah.
But I don't know
That's
if that
a
would
great-
like
that's-
bug people. Like it's almost interrupting something that shouldn't be interrupted. But
Well, yeah, but you're sort of taking it apart. You're sort of a mechanic looking at the engine, taking it apart,
director's commentary, if you
Commentary.
will.
That's how we can do this stuff, because it's commentary.
Yeah.
There you go.
Now, I guess we're about to jump into our next set of music, and 2 of the bands, I guess, that are coming up in this next set really became the face, I would say, of phase 2 of extreme metal progressiveness, which is Death and Atheist. I guess, what are they bringing to the table? That maybe the baton being passed from Voivod and Celtic Frost to these guys.
Yeah, Death and Atheist and, Cynic and all these kind of bands that I call tech metal in the book, and tech metal is just, a way to separate some of these progressive bands, and they just brought this really sharper technicality into their music. They were extreme. They began as, kind of these primitive death metal bands. Certainly early Death it doesn't get much more primitive than that.
No.
And again, just kind of, Chuck exploring his instrument and just kind of, growing in leaps and bounds as a musician over time. And becoming interested in maybe expressing himself outside of the horror genre. So they just became this kind of intellectual band, and that's kind of what marks the whole tech metal thing, is this focus on just really challenging yourselves and doing some drastically different things. So.
Cool. Yeah. And where's Deathrow fit into all this? They're a band.
Well, Deathrow came out of that German thrash scene of the '80s that hopefully we all know and love, and the first 2 albums are fairly pedestrian in that whole realm, and then the third album came out. And this is what makes a progressive band for me, is like when they start sort of in a basic mold, and then they at some point either take a really great leap or they gradually go somewhere very strange from where they began. And Deathrow's third album, Deception Ignored, was weird and technical and obviously influenced by Watchtower.
Yep.
It was like Creator playing a Watchtower cover. Then you got Deathrow's third album, and it's a really interesting sound. So.
It's funny. I wrote down, because no knowledge really of the band. I said I get some Testament and Watchtower vibes. Those were like the 2 bands that really like informed me. The Skolniak kind of solo type playing, and then some of the Watchtower vocals.
And I do hear some Voivod and Deathrow.
Yeah. But cool. All right. Well, let's get to some music. We've got from that Deathrow Deception Ignored album from 1988. We have Machinery. Then we have Individual Thought Patterns from Death with Overactive Imagination from 93. And then from that same watershed year of 93, which we'll talk about in the next set, we have Atheist with Mineral from the Elements record. You just heard Mineral from Atheist, Overactive Imagination from Death, and Machinery from Deathrow. And once again, of course, we're joined with Jeff, Mr. Wagner. So why those tracks, I guess, from Atheist and Death and those records in particular?
Death was, Individual Thought Patterns was one record on from Human, and I think Human was the big sort of sea change for Death, bringing in these, really literate musicians and, who had, the guys from Cynic had, considerable jazz influence. But then you get into Individual Thought Patterns, and it was just, just a little more refined version of Human, I think. Gene Hoglan playing drums that I don't think anybody who had listened to Dark Angel previously thought he could do, and he just really, he did the Sean Reinert thing pretty well in that album. And Steve DiGiorgio on bass, you could finally hear him on bass, because Human is notoriously bassless until this new reissue that's coming out.
Yeah.
So I just think it's Death at its most refined and its most technical, so it fits there. And with Atheist, the Elements album is a little less intense than Unquestionable Presence, and I probably prefer Unquestionable, but I think the Mineral track from Elements is probably Atheist at their kind of progressive and experimental apex. So, and they both come from 1993, which is a sort of a key year, and I devote basically a chapter of the book to that year.
I was going to say, that's kind of the watershed year, in the book.
The year I graduated high school.
Well, there you go.
The year I entered high school. It's a cross-generational year for all of us. So
yeah, and it was just all these bands that were sublimating at their highest point and just doing these things, and you just had this huge sort of handful of albums that were coming out that year or on either side of the year. There's some from '92 and '94 as well in there, but it was just this year where just technical, adventurous, progressive, extreme metal really kind of hit a certain peak.
Why do you think that is? I mean, do you think it's just happenstance, or?
There's a quote from. I hate to keep referencing the book, but really,
that's why we got you.
There's a quote from Hunter Ginn, the drummer for a newer band called Canvas Solaris, and I think he sums it up really well at the intro of that chapter. I could try to find it and read it. I just think that's the best answer to your question.
Oh, okay. If you want to, do you have the book chilling with you?
Yeah, I do. If you can give me a second.
Mark's looking through it too. I guess for me, the '93 year, this is like when I kind of became aware of death metal on a profound level, and then ran into Unquestionable Presence on tape and Cynic Focus and things like that. And so, I don't know, like it opened up my earwaves a little bit more in terms of being aware that metal was something more than just what you saw in Headbangers Ball,
Yeah. There was a point of sublimation in '93. I think that was a year that a lot of artistic metal was being created. I mean, no matter what you call it. If you allow me to read this quote, I think that'll be a great insight to listeners in terms of like answering your question best. So this is from Hunter Ginn, drummer for Canvas Solaris. He says, beginning of chapter 12. Death metal petered out by 1993. It got so saturated, labels flooded the market with the same old stuff. But there was this weird offshoot of death metal bands that grew sick of playing death metal and started listening to other kinds of music. Instead of giving up on metal, they found a way to integrate those influences, and you wound up with Atheist, Cynic, Believer, Pestilence, stretching out from where they had been before, and Gorguts growing exponentially. It was a trend across the board in general, not just in death metal. There was this overall spirit of experimentation that happened with Coroner and Anacrusis and all sorts of bands. For me, 1993 represents this pastiche and dialogue between past and future.
There you go. Like I said, cross-generational, past and future.
It's a great observation. It's very well put, and I just felt that it had to open that chapter.
Sure. And it's almost like from an extreme metal point of view too. It's like in my sense, it's like that's the year that the torch kind of got passed from America and Canada towards Europe, really, in a sense.
Oh yeah. I mean, we're talking to Mark, who started Requiem with Chris Dick, and that was a zine that I was really excited by because they were sort of unearthing all these bands that were happening at the time in Europe, like early at the gates. That was really different for the time. Opeth, same thing. Opeth, was just another one of these really exciting European bands that were starting to do some really different things. So you're very right. The torch was kind of passed from territory to territory there.
Yeah, and Chris and Mark were the ones, because I was, younger than them in high school, but they were the ones, my friends and I bought Requiem at a record store, and I knew who Chris was, but I had no idea that he actually did that. And then I went into the record store, and it's like, oh, you're the guy. Oh, and it just like my world just started expanding. I was like, why are these guys writing about all this European stuff and from Mount Pleasant? You know, it was pretty mind blowing. So and that
there's a lot of mind blowing stuff happening. And I remember getting my job at Relapse in '94, and I was turned on to like all these bands that I really hadn't heard about, like early Catatonia and Separation, like The Cube. I was like, this is fascinating. Like, who knew all this was out there? But and this was, of course, pre-internet, so that if you
sense of discovery,
if you didn't come across those names in zines, then you had to do it some other way. But,
well, you were saying that in the book that like if it hadn't been for like Metal Forces, like the tape trading stuff in Metal Forces, like you wouldn't have gotten a hold of a lot of this kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, that was a total conduit to stuff I wouldn't have had access to otherwise.
Now, I guess in terms of like coming back to that term progressive, like, this is a question that, people who are into progressive metal or progressive music in general always have to sort of defend. But I mean, what do you say to people who claim that the music's, can sometimes be cold or pretentious or unemotional or things like that? I mean, having written this book, what's your best, I guess, short, approach to answering those people?
I would say that technicality is the emotion. All right. Like if you look at a band like Oblivion, their Nemesis album, maybe not the best example because nobody knows that thing. That's quite obscure. But even like even Atheists or Cynics or bands like that, the coldness within that technicality is kind of the emotion. It's kind of the idea. To me, it always lent a sort of sci-fi or robotic element to it. Something that was kind of like otherworldly or non-human. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But I'm talking about the tech metal bands. Now, if you're talking about some of the Dream Theater type of bands that are just playing and doing like scales and runs and arpeggios endlessly, I do think that can get emotionless. And for that strain of melodic metal, I'd rather hear the emotion come out because I love a lot of really good, especially European style, like melodic metal. But once you start imitating Yngwie endlessly or just kind of showing everybody how good of a player you are, you're forgetting about the song. And I think songwriting is key no matter what kind of metal you're playing.
Sure.
So I hope that's
that makes
okay defense of that. So.
Yeah. No, and it's something, I've had to defend that as well, to people before because it can be tough. People hear complex music sometimes and they just think, why? Why does it have to be so damn challenging?
Sure. I mean, like if you think about, I don't know if you've heard Spastic Inc., but that band, that's Ron Jarzambek from Watchtower. It's his band. They've done 2 albums. It's totally wacko stuff. It's very focused on playing, but that guy plays, he's inhuman in his talent. So I think it's sometimes kind of fun to listen to somebody do something on an instrument that you could never do or you could never imagine doing. And that's the whole idea. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing wrong in playing. There's nothing wrong in being a great player. I do not like when somebody calls this music pretentious. That's also addressed in the book. Guys from Dysrhythmia and Opeth are quoted addressing that.
I love the comeback for that, by the way, in the book that those guys give.
Yeah, totally, because it's like, what, there is value in playing. And, just as there's value in, great sloppy punk or sloppy death metal or whatever it might be, there's also value in playing. I don't think anybody should ever be ashamed of pushing themselves and even being self-indulgent. And, man, indulge yourself. If you're a musician, go crazy. Indulge yourself. That's what you're doing it for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've just never bought that whole thing. To me, that's just like these snooty critics who probably write for Rolling Stone. I don't identify with it.
Sure. Well, and I think what helped me, and I know Mark would probably agree, was getting into like a lot of the like 60s free jazz kind of stuff and Cecil Taylor and listening to people that were just so masterful with the instruments but could kind of push it into so many different boundaries and almost create where most people would hear it as just pure noise. There's like a natural beauty that's kind of there in that. And that's some of the stuff that you hear in, like a Gorguts, Obscura record. You know what I mean?
Sure,
like it's in the midst of all that like anger and chaos and hatred that there's these really like pure emotions sort of happening.
Yeah, even like,
places.
play a little bit later on, the Deathspell Omega.
Yeah.
Which, to the uninitiated, I think, I mean, a lot of this comes back to learning how to listen a little bit more intently than just the casual person, you know, flipping on the radio and wants to sing along with whatever might be on the radio at the time. Yeah. Like the Deathspell Omega, you throw that on, like, you know, for somebody that's never heard anything like that, it's going to sound like radio static and just like chaoticness. But I think actually the biggest help for me personally was going and trying to figure out other forms of music, like figure out how to listen to jazz. Like, what do I key into on that? Is it the swing of the drums? Is it like trying to pick out that theme that's, you know, layered underneath all this horn noise or whatever? But,
right.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to just the kind of learning to listen more intently and more purposefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think, like you were saying earlier, you know, sometimes you're just not ready for a certain album or subgenre or style or something because you're just not there with your listening. You know, Don Anderson from Akercocke and Sculptured, I had a beer with him in Seattle last year at some point, and we were talking about music, of course, and he said something. I think he was doing some teaching at the time. Some students, you know, he's teaching music, and he told me he would tell these students, like, look, I never tell my students that I don't like something. I just tell them I don't know how to like it. Yep. It's like, you know what I mean? You just don't have, you know, because you never want to say that you just flat out hate something because, you know, in 10 years you might prove yourself wrong because you know hopefully people's tastes change. If you're a really kind of true music lover, you know, hopefully you're constantly seeking new things out, and that those new things will help you hear those older things in a different way sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll be the first to admit I was naive enough, you know, in high school to make fun of like King Diamond singing, you know, because I didn't get it, and now I'm unabashedly in love with King Diamond and his.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, I've always liked King Diamond, but I was like you know, in high school I'd make fun of certain things that I love now. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I'm talking like, you know, I've gotten a taste for some very slick kind of pop stuff, and I used to hate that shit. Yeah. And now I own 3 Crowded House albums. I think that stuff's masterful because it's a songwriting thing. Probably because my love for the Beatles has grown over the years. Yep. It's just about growing as a listener, and I think growing as a human, and we all grow. You know, hopefully your listening reflects that as well. You know,
and that's really what Mean Deviation's kind of about in a way.
2 days ago, I listened.
Yeah, that's probably a good capsule description of it. So, well, bye guys.
Yeah. No, it's funny because I know you haven't listened to probably a lot of the old episodes here and there, but I teach a rock and roll history class now to high schoolers, and it's been really neat for me because it's forced me to confront and learn a lot of cool music, but then I also have to give the similar mantra to what Don was saying from Akercocke, in that I told some of the kids, you know, we'll listen to, say, like Janis Joplin's performance at Monterey, and some of the kids are like, that was horrible. It was like shrieking. And then I have girls in the front row who are crying. They're like, there's tears pouring down their face because they're like, that was the most like amazing, emotional, like gut wrenching thing. And I kind of tell kids, I said, they're just, sometimes you're not going to like everything that you hear in this class, but absorb it because you never know, because somewhere down the road that stuff is maybe going to make sense and click into place for you, and you're going to have an aha moment. But if you build a wall and dismiss it, you'll never be available to have that emotional experience down the road and be and come to terms with some of the things that you've heard in the past. And so I kind of like his answer better than even that one, you know, that I'm
but no, yours is a good answer as well. Yeah, for sure.
You know, so, but
I don't know how to like it.
Yeah, I don't know how to like this yet, you know.
I've often thought of that. Yeah, it's like, you know, now instead of saying, oh, that sucks, I'll just say, I just don't know how to like it.
Yeah, being a high school teacher, I get a lot of questions about music that I'm not always ready to gravitate towards, you know, so that's maybe a better answer that comes off a little less pretentious than, you know, that sucks. Why are you listening to that, kid? You know, so.
Sure.
But I guess kind of bouncing back into the theme of where we're going with the music and stuff, you know, besides kind of the Florida death metal thing and the tech metal thing that we kind of alluded to, Mark and I kind of connected that there was almost a weird progressive extreme metal scene that was growing in Quebec and Montreal and along, you know, the back of Voivod, and then, you know, on the piggyback of the band we're going to hear next, Gorguts, and then into Cryptopsy and some of this other stuff. Is that
DBC?
Is that weird that you know we're seeing that in one concentrated area, that there was actually like a progressive extreme metal scene in Quebec, Montreal? Or
It kind of is, but I think all it takes is one or maybe two pioneers to really show that, not only can you be rewarded by playing this stuff, which, who Voivod was, but it just kind of, I don't know, I suppose, there's a sort of an organic outgrowth or maybe something a little incestuous there, where you're all friends, you're seeing each other, and your influences are rubbing off on each other. So maybe one of the guys from Voivod passed a Vandergraaf Generator album over to one of the guys in Oblivion or something like this,
yeah.
And they, it's really is kind of interesting, and it does form a kind of pattern. And there was definitely a surge of something going on in Quebec there in the late '80s, early '90s. I mean, you had, like you say, Gorguts, you had Oblivion, you had DBC. All these bands kind of had a Voivodish sort of twist to them,
sure.
And it kind of kept going. You have Cryptopsy, who are maybe not totally progressive, but definitely on the more intellectual and technical and performance oriented side. And Cataclysm, I think early Cataclysm anyway,
for sure,
was all about that. So it's in the water, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, something kind of odd. So,
but I think if you look at Voivod, they were kind of like the catalyst for that. Whereas, like in the Seattle scene in the late '80s, you had probably the first band being, well, not the first band, but like a big band that made a big leap was Soundgarden, and then you had a lot of bands that kind of followed suit, and it just became organic. Like it grows organically. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it also lasts a short period of time. I mean, the Seattle thing died down, the Quebec thing died down.
Stockholm died down.
Yeah.
What died down?
Stockholm. Yeah, Stockholm.
Yeah, exactly. Or it changes. I shouldn't say it died down, but it changes. It morphs. So.
Cool.
Yeah, interesting. I've always, to me, like, if a new band comes out of Canada, or at least back in the '90s, it was like always very exciting because you kind of felt like you were going to get some level of quality there.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, let's get back into the Canadian scene a little bit with some Gorguts. This is a song we actually heard back in the Canadian metal podcast that we did, Condemned to Obscurity from Erosion to Sanity from '93, and then we're going to sort of leapfrog a few years, and we'll have Jeff fill us in on why when we come back to Akercocke with Words That Go Unspoken from the same record from 2005. And then Hieronymus Bosch is Broke from Equivoke in 2008. So enjoy. That was Hieronymus Bosch with Broke. Akercocke, I think, possibly, the pronunciation, with Words That Go Unspoken. And then we started with Gorguts, Condemned to Obscurity. So a little bit about, like, for instance, Hieronymus Bosch is a band like Mark and I aren't terribly familiar with. Give us a little...
What are they, Russian band?
They're Russian. They are no longer around. Unfortunately, the book printed, and I think they broke up a week later.
Oh, jeez.
And Mike Portnoy left Dream Theater a week after the book went to the press too. So that's how it goes.
Yeah.
Instantly dated. But yeah, Hieronymus Bosch are just this band that, to me, they're kind of like an honorary. We were just talking about the Quebecois scene. Of the late '80s, early '90s, and Hieronymus Bosch are kind of an honorary band of that ilk for me, because they kind of seem to have that Oblivion sound. There's a French band called Loud Blast who, to me, were more Quebecois than anything on that one album, Sublime Dementia. Yeah. The only album that they were really kind of, progressive. So yeah, they just have that going on, and they brought it into the modern metal. They did 3 albums of this really kind of technical and interesting death metal, weird backwards sounding riffs and stuff like that.
Yeah. So. And then the Gorguts and Akercocke, those are 2 bands that are still around today, but kind of coming from totally different approaches. I mean, Akercocke almost started off as like a black metal band and gravitated into this super technical death metal band,
Yeah, well, not only super technical death metal, but really like drawing from when Words That Go Unspoken came out, that was a huge leap from the previous album, Corone Zone or whatever. Yep. They were throwing like stuff. I heard like some Anacrusis in there, and why did I hear Anacrusis in there? Because Anacrusis used to draw from like new wave. So it was kind of like this chain that I started to hear, and I'm sure Akercocke, or however the hell you want to say it.
Let's say it differently every time.
Probably not influenced by Anacrusis, but certainly by, new wave. You start hearing new wave in their music, and you start hearing, I hear, there's elements of Dead Can Dance in their stuff. Yep. So it's really, they really morphed into this really interesting thing that just sounds like nobody else. Again, another hallmark of a truly progressive metal band is that you're just, somebody can tell your music right away from like the first, 30 seconds. There's just no, there's no real solid similarity to anybody else. So, and I think they have that going on now.
And I think Gorguts the same as well. Mean, Erosion of Sanity sort of opened them up to what the sound that they were going to go with, like by the time Obscure came out in '98.
Yeah, sure. Obscure is just such a weird album that it really, came out 5 years after Erosion. We heard something from Erosion. That was, like you say, that was just the beginning.
But Condemned to Obscurity, you started to bring in all these like new instruments, and like doesn't Luc Lemay play the piano at the beginning there?
Yeah, he's the piano track is him playing, and so that was just obviously taking a great leap. Their first album was totally, and I mean this in the best way possible, but totally generic Florida death metal wannabe stuff. Yeah. It was good and solid for what it was, but it was really nothing new. And then Erosion of Sanity came out, and you're like, oh wow, these guys have been listening to classical music. These guys have been listening to probably like Musique Concrete or something, because there was so much dissonance and so much chaos in what they were doing all of a sudden, and very well played. So super interesting band.
Yeah, and I guess the last question for us to close out part 1 of this little 2-part thing is, kind of after the watershed year of '93, which Gorguts we just heard was part of that thing. You have bands like Opeth, Arcturus Enslaved, Dillinger Escape Plan, Dysrhythmia, kind of start flooding the scene in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then you even have, like, in the mainstream sense, bands like Dream Theater, Tool, Radiohead, even Meshuggah to some extent are kind of entering mainstream acceptance. Like, I guess to close out this first part, I mean, what do you equate with this, I guess, mini prog renaissance that sort of happens in the late 90s, early 2000s, not just in metal, but just kind of across the board? Was there a pattern you noticed in writing the book, or things that you drew from, or?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a good question. I think one of the sort of reasons or catalysts for that was the prog rock, which was really the first strain of truly progressive rock music. That kind of stuff, we're talking about the 70s stuff, either from England or Italy or whatever, Germany. That stuff is kind of dead and moribund in the 90s. So I think you had a lot of bands, that kind of inflamed the imagination in the 90s. They might have been heavier, but they were kind of filling that void, or at least appealing to a new audience the way that old prog rock did to people of that generation.
Mm-hmm.
Why it gains, commercial acceptance or some degree of commercial acceptance, that's a good question. I think it had been churning for a while in the 80s and the early 90s, early to mid 90s. It had been churning there for a while, and then all of a sudden, I think it was a matter of people catching up to it, just the same way that lots of people have caught up to Voivod after the fact.
Yeah.
I think people were just kind of ready. Like it, certain bands had to sort of set the ground, lay the groundwork first. For other bands to leap off from, and by the time these Dillingers came up and these Dysrhythmias and these Tools and Opeths and stuff, people were just a little more open to that. I think. I don't know. I'm a really bad judge of
cultural trends and stuff.
Cultural trends, and
hard,
trying to guess what might have happened. It's not,
because I don't think anything was it wasn't like a united scene in any kind of way.
Definitely not. And we're talking, and if you look at, if you're looking at the more melodic strain of prog metal, which we're not doing on these shows, but that was quite big at the time as well. And there was a very explosive scene
with
going
some
on.
Of that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it wasn't like a big unified thing. I just think that people's metal palettes were finally starting to expand and accept.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, well, it's a good way to sort of close us out here. I guess introduce, as brief as possible, Deathspell Omega is, I guess, the first thing we're going to play that would fall into the progressive black metal category. But why this song and why this record to sort of close things out with part one here?
Well, it's the latest record. It came out last year, and it kind of continues on from where they started a few years ago. And I think what's fascinating about this band is not just I listen to this and I think, how can human beings possibly come up with this? It just sounds so inhuman, and otherworldly. And I think it's also interesting to note that they started as a very kind of boring, orthodox black metal band that really they didn't show any clue of how they were going to develop. So I think that instantly makes them a progressive band.
Yeah, and their evolution, especially over the last couple EPs and albums in the last, say, 5-6 years, has been pretty extraordinary. I know they were a band that weren't really on my radar until about 5 or 6 years ago when Mark kind of introduced them to me, and I was like, oh.
Yeah, I picked up an EP at a record store or something. I was like, it was something that I was totally filling a void that at the time, just black metal. What can you possibly do with that genre? And this is just blows the doors off it.
Was it the Kinose EP or whatever?
Yeah.
Same here. And I remember talking to my friend Hunter, the guy from Canvas Solaris, about that. We were like, when's that next black metal band going to come and blow us away? It's been a while.
Yeah.
And then I think I got Kinos the 2 weeks later, and there was the answer.
There it was.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was. So. All right, so a perfect way to sort of end part one, where we sort of were looking more at the extreme progressive side. So we're going to keep Jeff imprisoned for a week so we can record another episode that you'll hear, part two, where we kind of look more at the bizarre side of things. But so Jeff, thank you for part one. We appreciate it. We hope you'll stick around for part two. Otherwise,
I'll stick around for a week in prison.
We're screwed for part two. Otherwise, we'd like to thank Jill Hundey for sponsoring this episode. And once again, we have the Thursday and Friday tickets for the Maryland Death Fest available in a free contest. So promote the show. Send us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Leave us a review. Maybe promote it on iTunes. Even
give us a star rating. Put it on your blog. If you peruse the forums, like metal forums, do some name dropping, because when we do it, it looks self-serving.
Yep, exactly. The Decibel forum is a pretty active one that I know of, and I know some other ones too. So, so do that for us, and who knows, maybe you'll be rewarded with some free tickets to the.
We'll buy you a hot dog or some nachos at the show.
Yeah,
if you find us.
Yeah, there you go. But all right, so for Deathspell Omega's Malconfort, which is a great title when you really think about it, anti-comfort. And from Paracletus from 2010, I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.
And thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Regenerate Rome.